The last time I saw Jane alive, she was lying in a hospital bed with tubes snaking out of her arms, her face slack on one side from the stroke. But even then, even with her body failing her, something flickered behind her eyes when a certain name was mentioned, something that looked a lot like fear. I need to tell you about Jane, and I need to tell you about the man who wouldn't let her go. Jane was one of those people who just made the world feel a little warmer. She worked with me for years, and somewhere along the way she stopped being just a colleague and became something closer to a second mother. She was the one who remembered my birthday when no one else did. She was the one who would pull me aside on a rough day and say the exact right thing, not in some grand, poetic way, but in that quiet, steady way that only people who genuinely care about you can manage. She had this little apartment she loved, filled with soft blankets and the smell of whatever she'd been cooking that morning, and she had 2 cats that she treated like royalty. She talked about those cats constantly. You couldn't know Jane for more than 5 minutes without hearing about them. So when everything started to fall apart, it wasn't the horror itself that got to me first. It was the slow, creeping realization that something had been wrong for a long time, and I just hadn't seen it. Jane had a boyfriend named Steve. At least, that's what she called him. Long-term boyfriend. She mentioned him here and there, casually, the way you mention someone who's just part of the background of your life. I never thought much about it. She never gave me a reason to. But looking back now, I realize how little she actually said about him. She'd reference him in passing and then steer the conversation somewhere else. And I let her, because I trusted that if something were wrong, she would tell me. She didn't tell me. The strokes came fast and cruel. The first one was bad. The second one was worse. By the time I got to the hospital, Jane was barely there. She could look at you, and sometimes you could feel her trying to communicate, trying to push words through a body that had stopped cooperating. But mostly she just lay still, breathing in that shallow, mechanical way that makes a hospital room feel like a waiting room for something you don't want to name. Steve was already there when I arrived. I remember walking into that room and feeling something shift, like the temperature dropped a single degree, just enough to notice. He was sitting in the chair beside her bed, and he looked up at me with this expression that I can only describe as blank. Not sad, not worried, not the face of a man watching someone he loved slip away. Just blank, like a mask someone had forgotten to paint emotions onto. I introduced myself, told him I was a close friend of Jane's, that I worked with her, that she meant the world to me. He nodded, barely, and then he started talking about her. That's when the first crack appeared. He said she lived in a house on the other side of town. Jane lived in an apartment. A small, cozy apartment that she had lived in for years. He described the place like he'd never set foot in it, because I don't think he had. Not recently. Maybe not ever. Then he mentioned her pets, and he said she had a dog. Jane had cats. 2 cats. She adored those cats. Anyone who had spent even a single evening with Jane knew about the cats. I stood there, listening to this man describe a version of Jane that didn't exist, and something cold started to settle in my stomach. It wasn't just that he was wrong, it was that he was confidently wrong. He spoke about her with this strange, possessive familiarity, like he owned the narrative of who she was. But the details were all hollow. He had the title of boyfriend, but none of the substance, none of the knowing. I didn't say anything. Not then. Jane was lying right there, and the last thing I wanted was to cause a scene in her hospital room. But I watched him. I watched the way he sat in that chair like it was a throne, the way he spoke about her condition with a detachment that bordered on clinical, the way he never once reached over to hold her hand. Jane passed away 3 days later. The grief hit me like a wall. I won't pretend otherwise. I cried at my desk. I cried in my car. I cried in the shower where no one could hear me. Jane was gone, and the world felt dimmer for it, the way it always does when you lose someone who carried. But grief wasn't the only thing waiting for me. A few days after the funeral, I went to Jane's apartment to help sort through some of her things. Her landlord was there, a quiet, older woman who had known Jane for years. We were packing up boxes, moving carefully through the space that still smelled like Jane, still felt like her, when the landlord said something that stopped me cold. She asked if I knew about Steve. I said yes. He was Jane's boyfriend. And the landlord looked at me with this expression, this tired, knowing, slightly frightened expression, and she shook her head slowly. She told me that Jane had been hiding from him. The words didn't register at first. They just hung in the air between us like something fragile and dangerous. Hiding. Jane had been hiding from Steve. The landlord explained that Jane had confided in her months ago, told her that Steve was unstable, that he had threatened her, that she was afraid of what he might do. Jane had asked the landlord not to give out her address, not to confirm she lived there if anyone came asking. She had been living in a state of quiet, constant vigilance, and she had told almost no one. She hadn't told me. That fact alone nearly broke me all over again. Not because I was hurt that she kept it secret, but because I understood why she did. Jane was proud. Jane was private. Jane handled things on her own because that's who she was. And maybe, just maybe, she was afraid that if she told people, it would make the situation more real, more dangerous. Sometimes silence feels like the only shield you have, even when it's made of nothing at all. Suddenly, everything about Steve at the hospital made a sickening kind of sense. The wrong details, the blank expression, the possessive confidence about a woman whose life he clearly hadn't been part of in a long time. He wasn't a grieving boyfriend. He was something else entirely, something that had been circling Jane from a distance, maintaining a claim on her that she had desperately tried to sever. And now Jane was gone, and whatever fixation Steve had carried for her needed somewhere new to land. It landed on me. The first text came about a week after I learned the truth from the landlord. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message was personal, too personal. It referenced things about my schedule, my workplace, details that someone would only know if they had been paying close attention. The message itself wasn't overtly threatening. It was almost conversational, friendly even, in a way that made my skin crawl precisely because of how normal it was trying to sound. I knew it was Steve before I even confirmed it. I didn't respond. I screenshot the message, saved it, and tried to go about my day. But the next day, another one came. And then another. They were always just personal enough to remind me that he knew things about me, always just casual enough that if you showed them to someone out of context, they might shrug and say it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Each message was a small, deliberate reminder that he was watching, that he was close. Then he started showing up at my job. The first time, I almost convinced myself it was a coincidence. He walked in, looked around, didn't buy anything, and left. But he lingered. He stood near the entrance for a while, scanning the room, and when his eyes found me, he held my gaze for just a beat too long before turning and walking out. My hands were shaking for an hour afterward. The second time, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. He came in again, same pattern, wandering aimlessly, not purchasing a thing, just existing in the space where I worked. He didn't approach me directly. He didn't say a word. He just occupied the room, letting his presence do the talking. And the message was clear. I know where you are. I can be here whenever I want. I told him to stop. I was direct. I was firm. I said plainly that I did not want contact with him, that he needed to stop texting me, and that he needed to stop coming to my workplace. For a normal person, that would have been enough. For Steve, it was nothing. Less than nothing. He came back the next week. Same routine. Walk in, drift around, buy nothing, watch me, leave. Each visit is a quiet act of intimidation, and the worst part is how mundane it looks from the outside. He's not screaming. He's not making threats in front of witnesses. He's just a man standing in a store, and if you didn't know the context, you wouldn't look twice. But I know the context. I know what he did to Jane. I know she spent the last stretch of her life looking over her shoulder because of this man, and now I understand that feeling in a way I never wanted to. I keep thinking about Jane in her apartment, double-checking the lock, asking her landlord to keep her address secret, carrying that weight every single day without telling anyone. I think about how exhausting that must have been, how lonely. And I think about the fact that even after everything she did to protect herself, he still showed up at her hospital bed, still sat in that chair like he belonged there, still spoke about her life as though he had any right to it. He's still coming to my workplace, As of right now, nothing has changed. He drifts in like a ghost, takes up space, watches, and leaves. He never buys anything. He never speaks to anyone else. He's there for one reason, and we both know what it is. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if this escalates, or if it stays in this horrible, gray area where nothing is technically illegal, but everything feels dangerous. What I do know is that Jane tried to handle this alone, and it consumed the final chapter of her life. I'm not going to make that same mistake. I'm telling people, I'm documenting everything, and I'm not going to let the memory of the kindest woman I've ever known be overshadowed by the man who refused to let her live in peace. But every time that door opens at work, my eyes snap to it. Every single time, and I hold my breath until I see who walks through. Sometimes it's a customer, sometimes it's nobody, and sometimes it's Steve, just standing there, not saying a word, watching. The tire blew somewhere between the last casino billboard and the edge of nowhere. 1 second they were cruising down a stretch of Las Vegas road that had slowly emptied of other cars, the city's glow fading in the rearview mirror like a dying ember. The next, there was a violent shudder beneath them, a sound like a gunshot, and the car lurched hard to the right. Marcus wrestled the wheel, pulling them onto the gravel shoulder before the vehicle shuddered to a stop. The silence that followed felt immediate and total, the kind of silence that only exists when you realize how far you are from anything familiar. He killed the engine. Outside, the desert stretched in every direction, flat and black and indifferent. "You okay?" he asked. His wife, Dana, nodded, though her hands were still braced against the dashboard. She exhaled slowly and looked out the window at the darkness pressing against the glass. There were no streetlights here, no other headlights, just the faint, distant smear of the strip on the horizon, looking almost like a mirage from this far out. Marcus got out to assess the damage. The rear passenger tire had shredded completely, not a slow leak, not a nail, but a full blowout. He crouched beside it, running a hand over the ruined rubber, and felt the familiar sinking weight of a problem with no quick solution. The spare was undersized, and he wasn't even sure the jack was in good shape. He stood up, looked down the empty road in both directions, and felt the first quiet thread of unease begin to wind itself around his chest. Dana had stepped out too, arms folded against the dry desert chill. She stood near the hood, her phone raised, searching for a signal that kept flickering in and out. 1 bar, 0 bars, 1 bar again. "I can try to call roadside assistance," she said, "but I don't know if it'll go through." That was when the headlights appeared. They came from behind them, moving at a steady, unhurried pace, not slowing down the way most passing cars don't, but actually pulling off the road and easing to a stop just ahead of their car. The vehicle was a late-model luxury sedan, dark-colored, clean in a way that felt almost deliberate out here on a dusty desert road. The engine idled quietly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was well-dressed, not flashy, but expensive in a quiet, considered way. Her clothes fit perfectly. Her hair was neat. She moved with the kind of easy confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to, and she was smiling before she'd even fully crossed the distance between them. It was a warm smile, practiced. "Oh, you poor things," she said, her voice carrying a light, musical quality. "I saw you pulled over and I just couldn't drive past. Are you all right?" Dana smiled back, the natural reflex of someone being approached with apparent kindness. "We blew a tire. We're trying to figure out if we can get someone out here." "Oh, don't even worry about that," the woman said, waving her hand as if the problem were already solved. "My brother-in-law runs a tow service. He's wonderful. And honestly, he'd do it for free. He's just that kind of person. I can call him right now." She already had her phone out, already scrolling. "There's a lot just up the road. Maybe 2 minutes from here. He could meet you there. It's easier than waiting out here in the dark, don't you think?" It was reasonable. It was generous. It was exactly the kind of offer that, under different circumstances, would have felt like a small miracle. But something about it sat wrong. Dana glanced back at the car. Marcus had moved around to the trunk to dig out the jack. and from where the woman was standing slightly to the side, focused entirely on Dana. He wasn't visible. The car's interior was dark. The angle was wrong. To anyone approaching from the front or the driver's side, the passenger seat would have looked empty. The woman's attention hadn't drifted once toward the car. It stayed fixed on Dana with a warmth that, the longer it lasted, began to feel less like friendliness and more like focus. "I really appreciate it," Dana said carefully, "but my husband is here with me. We'll probably just wait for roadside." "Oh, it's no trouble at all," the woman said, and there was something in the way she said it, a slight quickening, a subtle shift in register that made the words feel less like reassurance and more like insistence. "Honestly, it's not safe out here. You shouldn't be standing on the side of the road in the dark. Why don't you just ride with me? It's 2 minutes. Your husband can follow in the car once it's sorted." There it was. The suggestion that Dana should separate from the car, from Marcus. "Come on," the woman said, her smile widening just slightly. "I'll wait while you grab your things." Dana took a small step back without fully realizing she'd done it. "I think we're okay, really. Thank you, though." The woman's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a barely perceptible tightening, like a mask adjusting itself. She tried again, softer this time, leaning into the warmth. She mentioned the lot again. She mentioned her brother-in-law again. She said the road was dangerous, that it was late, that she'd feel terrible leaving a woman alone out here. Each sentence was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a kind of gentle, relentless pressure. And then Marcus appeared from behind the car. He'd given up on the jack and come around to the passenger side, straightening up into the wash of the woman's headlights. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He wasn't even looking at her. He was just there, a second person, a husband, a witness, visible now in a way he hadn't been before. The woman saw him. The change was instantaneous. The smile didn't fade so much as it simply ceased to exist, like a light being switched off. Her body language shifted in a single, fluid motion. Shoulders pulling back, weight redistributing, the easy confidence collapsing into something that looked, unmistakably, like alarm. Her eyes moved from Marcus to Dana and back again. And in that fraction of a second, something passed across her face that she couldn't quite suppress. It was fear, not the polite discomfort of someone caught in an awkward situation, not embarrassment. Fear, the kind that lives in the body, that moves through the limbs before the mind has finished processing. She said something brief. Marcus couldn't hear it clearly. Dana would later describe it as a half-formed excuse, the words already dissolving as they left her mouth. Then the woman turned, walked back to her car with quick, purposeful steps, got in, and drove away. No hesitation, no backward glance. The taillights shrank and disappeared into the dark. The road was empty again. Marcus and Dana stood in the silence for a moment, neither of them speaking. The desert wind moved through the scrub grass at the edge of the shoulder. Somewhere far off, a truck rumbled past on a different road entirely. "She didn't know you were there," Dana said finally. Her voice was quiet. "No," Marcus said, "she didn't." They looked at each other across the roof of the car. The unspoken thing between them was heavy and cold. And neither of them wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real, would transform a strange encounter into something with a shape and a name and an intention. Dana had been standing alone on the side of a dark road. The car had looked empty from the outside. A well-dressed woman in an expensive car had stopped, offered help, and spent several minutes trying, with increasing persistence, to get Dana to either get into her vehicle or walk to an isolated parking lot in the dark. And the moment she saw that Dana wasn't alone, the moment the calculation changed, she left. Immediately, without another word. They got the tire changed in near silence. Marcus worked the jack with focused, mechanical efficiency, and Dana stood close to the car, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the road. Every set of headlights that appeared in the distance made her go still until it passed. They didn't talk much on the drive back toward the city. The lights of Las Vegas rebuilt themselves on the horizon, bright and loud and indifferent to everything that happened in the dark outside their reach. Marcus kept both hands on the wheel. He kept checking the mirrors. He still thinks about the way that woman's face changed. the way the warmth evaporated the instant she realized her mistake. Whatever she had been planning, whatever she had been counting on, it had required Dana to be alone. It had required no witnesses. It had required the kind of isolation that a dark road and a broken-down car and a generous offer of help could so easily provide. He thinks about how close it was, how ordinary it all looked, how easily it could have gone differently. And he thinks about all the people who don't have someone in the passenger seat. The night they almost didn't come home began with something as ordinary as an empty gas tank. It was 1986, somewhere in the flat, featureless heart of Kansas, where the roads stretch out like black ribbons, unraveling into nothing, and the nearest town always seems to be just a little farther than you think. Two young men barely out of their teens, full of that particular brand of confidence that only the young and the lucky carry, had been driving for hours when the engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The car rolled to a stop on the shoulder of a road that had no streetlights, no houses, no signs of life in any direction. Just flat land, dry grass, and a sky so dark it felt like a ceiling pressing down. They sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, the kind of silence that feels too complete, too deliberate. Then they got out and stood in the warm night air, looking up and down the road. Nothing. Not a single pair of headlights in either direction. No glow on the horizon. Just the wind moving through the grass with a low, papery hiss. They started walking. There wasn't much else to do. One of them had a lighter. The other had half a pack of cigarettes. And between them they had maybe $4 in cash. They walked along the gravel shoulder, their sneakers crunching in the dark, talking to keep the quiet from getting too heavy. They joked about it. Of course they did. That's what you do when you're young and you don't yet understand that some situations aren't funny until much later, if ever. They had been walking for maybe 20 minutes when they saw the headlights. The vehicle came from behind them, moving slowly, too slowly for the open road. Most people out here drove fast, eager to get somewhere, anywhere. This one crept. The headlights swept over them and the engine dropped to an idle, and then a van pulled up alongside them and stopped. It was a plain, dark-colored van, no windows on the sides. The kind of vehicle that exists in a specific category of memory. The kind parents warn their children about. The kind that appears in the background of nightmares. The passenger window rolled down, and a man leaned out. He was smiling. He asked where they were headed. They explained, ran out of gas, looking for a station, didn't know how far it was. The man nodded like this was the most natural thing in the world, and said they'd give them a lift, plenty of room, hop in. And because they were young and tired, and the road was dark and empty, and the walk seemed endless, they got in. The back of the van was dim. There were no seats along the walls, just the bare metal floor and a few scattered items. A blanket, some tools, nothing that told a clear story. 3 men total. The driver, the front passenger who had leaned out the window, and a third man already sitting in the back when the 2 friends climbed in. The third man barely looked up. He sat with his knees drawn slightly toward his chest, his arms resting on them, staring at the floor with the expression of someone who was somewhere else entirely in his mind. The van pulled back onto the road. At first, the conversation was normal enough. The driver asked where they were from, made a comment about the heat, said the nearest gas station was a ways out but no trouble. The front passenger laughed at something that wasn't quite a joke. The 2 friends sat close together on the metal floor, their backs against the side of the van, and tried to look relaxed. Then the driver and the front passenger began talking to each other. It started quietly, low voices, almost murmured, the way people talk when they think no one is really listening. Maybe they assumed the road noise covered it. Maybe they didn't care. But in the hollow metal shell of that van, sound traveled in strange ways, and every word carried. The 2 friends heard everything. They heard the driver describe a place, a specific place, somewhere off the road, down a dirt track, far enough from the highway that no one would hear anything. He described it with the casual familiarity of someone who had been there before, or had thought about going there many times. The front passenger responded in a low, agreeable tone. They talked about what they would do when they got there. They talked about it the way men talk about stopping for food or pulling over to stretch their legs, matter-of-factly, without heat, without urgency. That was the worst part. Not rage, not excitement, just a flat, practical discussion about violence, about the two young men sitting 3 feet behind them. The friends did not look at each other. They didn't dare. They sat perfectly still, breathing carefully, staring at nothing, while every nerve in their bodies screamed. The van was moving. The road outside was dark. There were no door handles on the inside of the back doors, or if there were, neither of them could see them clearly enough to be sure. They were in a box, on a road in the middle of nowhere, listening to 2 men plan their deaths. And then the third man spoke. He had been silent the entire time, sitting in his corner with that distant, inward expression. But now he said something. His voice was quiet but firm, and what he said stopped the conversation in the front completely. He said he wasn't going to be part of it. He said he had a baby at home. A new baby. He said it simply, without drama, as if that fact, the existence of a new life, something small and dependent and innocent waiting for him somewhere, had drawn a line in him that he hadn't known was there until this moment. He wasn't going to do this. He wasn't going to be part of what they were planning. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it had weight. The driver didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just went quiet. And then, without a word of explanation, he slowed the van and pulled over to the side of the road. The back doors opened. The 2 friends climbed out into the night air, and the van pulled away, its taillights shrinking in the dark until they disappeared entirely around a long, flat curve. The 2 young men stood on the shoulder of the road in the middle of Kansas, in the middle of the night, and they were alive. They didn't speak for a long moment. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. They walked the rest of the way to the gas station. They got their gas. They drove home. And for years afterward, one of them would think about that third man, the quiet one in the back, the one with the new baby, and wonder what it means that a single ordinary life, small and new and not yet aware of the world, had been the thing standing between them and the dog. He already knew about the dog. That was the part that kept her up at night. Not the messages, not the way he'd started calling her sweetheart before they'd exchanged more than a dozen words, not even the way he'd shown up uninvited. It was the dog. The specific, deliberate question about whether the dog was aggressive, because she had never told him they had a dog. It started simply enough. A Facebook post, the kind everyone makes in summer. Does anyone know a reliable person for lawn care? And within the hour, a man named Charles had slid into her messages. Friendly, eager. He had a truck, he said. He had equipment. He could start that weekend if she wanted. She said yes. Why wouldn't she? It was just the lawn. The first visit seemed fine. She watched from the window as he worked. A heavy-set man in a faded cap, moving the mower in slow, methodical rows. Nothing alarming, nothing strange. She paid him through the app and thanked him, and that should have been the end of it. But then the messages started. Hey sweetheart, just checking, you home today? She stared at the screen for a long moment, told herself it was nothing. Some people were just like that, overly familiar, didn't know where the line was. She replied politely that she was busy and left it at that. You around this weekend, babe? I can come by. There it was again. Babe. She hadn't given him any reason to speak to her that way. She hadn't encouraged it, hadn't responded warmly, hadn't done anything except hire him to cut her grass. And yet the messages kept coming, not every day, but often enough that she began to dread the notification sound on her phone. Always asking if she was home. Always asking when she'd be there. Always with that particular, possessive warmth that made her skin crawl. She fired him, sent a short, firm message thanking him for his time, but letting him know she wouldn't be needing his services anymore. She kept it professional. She didn't explain herself. He didn't take it well. Within an hour, he messaged back claiming he had already come by and cut the grass, without being asked, without any arrangement, without her knowledge, and that she owed him cash. Immediately, he needed it now. The tone had shifted, the friendliness stripped away, replaced by something harder and more demanding. She checked the yard. She wasn't sure. Maybe the grass did look slightly shorter. Maybe it didn't. She couldn't tell, and that uncertainty made her feel sick, because it meant he might have been at her house while she wasn't watching, while she didn't know. She didn't pay him. She blocked his number and tried to move on. Months passed. The memory faded to a low background unease, the kind you learn to live with, the kind you convince yourself was probably nothing. She got engaged. Life moved forward. She told herself the story of the creepy lawn guy the way you tell any uncomfortable story once enough time has passed, with a nervous laugh, as a cautionary tale about strangers on the internet. Then he came back. She wasn't home when it happened. Her fiancé was there alone, and he answered the door to find Charles standing on the front step, calm as anything, as if no time had passed at all, as if he belonged there. He said he was in the neighborhood, just stopping by. Her fiancé, who didn't know the full history, who didn't feel the particular chill that name carried, made polite conversation. And Charles asked questions. Careful, specific, methodical questions. The kind that don't sound alarming in the moment, but that, laid out in sequence, form a very clear picture of what someone is trying to learn. Do you two live alone here? Is that your dog? Is he aggressive? You got pests up in the attic? I heard something when I was working out front. Her fiancé answered. Of course he answered. They were just questions, the kind a neighbor might ask, the kind that seem harmless in isolation. He didn't know. He had no reason to be suspicious. But she knew. When he told her about the visit later that evening, she felt the blood leave her face. Because they had never told Charles about the dog. She had never mentioned it in any of their messages. She had never posted about it in the original lawn care request. The only way he could have known was if he had been watching, scrolling through her social media, her photos, her check-ins, her tagged posts, building a quiet, patient picture of her life from the outside. He knew about the dog because he had been looking, and now he knew they had one, and whether it was aggressive, and whether they lived alone, and whether there was a reason to go up into the attic. She sat with that knowledge in the silence of her living room, the dog asleep at her feet, her fiancé in the next room, the house locked and the lights on, and she thought about all the things a person needs to know before they decide to do something. All the reconnaissance that looks, from the outside, like small talk. He wasn't just a strange man who sent uncomfortable messages. He was someone who had come back, someone who had done his homework, someone who was still, quietly, paying attention. And the lawn, just outside the window, looked exactly as it always did. Ordinary, familiar, perfectly kept. The restaurant had that kind of warm, golden lighting that makes everything feel like a memory even while you're still living it. Candles flickered on white tablecloths, silverware clinked softly against porcelain, and the low murmur of conversation filled the room like background music. It was our anniversary, and we'd saved up for weeks to afford a place like this. The kind of place where the menus don't have pictures, and the waiter calls you sir without a trace of irony. We were young, sure, barely old enough to know what love even meant. But sitting across from each other in that dim, elegant room, we felt like we'd carved out a small corner of the adult world just for ourselves. I remember looking at him across the table and feeling this swell of quiet happiness. His tie was slightly crooked. He'd borrowed it from his dad. I didn't tell him. I just smiled and reached across to straighten it, and he caught my hand and held it there against his chest for a moment. It was one of those perfect, fragile little moments that you tuck away somewhere safe inside yourself. And then the night cracked open. It started with a sound. A loud, wet laugh from the table behind us. The kind of laugh that doesn't come from joy but from the bottom of a glass. I didn't turn around at first. I just felt it, the way you feel someone watching you before you see them. A prickling heat on the back of my neck. A shift in the air. My boyfriend noticed it too. His eyes flicked over my shoulder and then back to me. And something in his expression tightened just slightly. The laugh came again, closer this time, followed by a voice that was too loud for the room. Thick and slurred, like the words had to fight their way past his tongue. Well now, would you look at that? I turned. He was maybe 3 tables away. A heavy-set man in his late 50s or early 60s, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. His shirt was unbuttoned, 1 button too many, and a gold chain caught the candlelight against the damp skin of his chest. There was a glass of something amber in his hand, nearly empty, and the way he held it told me it wasn't his first or his fourth. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, but they were pointed directly at us. At me. His wife sat across from him, a thin woman with careful makeup and the kind of rigid posture that comes from years of pretending not to notice things. She was staring at her plate like it contained the answers to every question she'd ever been afraid to ask. "You two," the man said, louder now, pointing at us with the hand that held his glass. A little liquid sloshed over the rim and darkened the tablecloth. "You two are just about the prettiest damn couple I've ever seen in my life." My boyfriend gave a polite, tight-lipped smile, the kind you give to strangers on the bus who talk too loud. "Thanks," he said, and turned back to me, clearly hoping that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. "No, I mean it," the man continued, his voice carrying across the dining room like a stone thrown through glass. Other diners were starting to glance over. "Look at her. I mean, really look at her. That face. That hair. You're a lucky son of a gun, you know that?" The compliment landed wrong. Everything about it landed wrong. It wasn't what he said so much as how he said it. The way his eyes moved over me slowly, deliberately, like he was appraising something at an auction. I felt my skin tighten. I reached for my water glass just to have something to do with my hands. My boyfriend's jaw clenched. "We appreciate it," he said, a little firmer this time. "We're just trying to enjoy our dinner." For a moment, the man seemed to consider this. He blinked slowly, swirled the last of his drink, and drained it. I thought maybe that was it. Maybe the alcohol would pull him back into his own orbit and leave us alone. Then he stood up. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. His wife looked up sharply, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. She just watched him go, her hands flat on the table, her knuckles white. He crossed the distance between our tables in 4 heavy steps and dropped himself into the empty chair beside me. Just like, no invitation, no hesitation. He sat down at our table like he'd been expected, like he belonged there, and the smell of him hit me immediately. Whiskey and cologne and something sour underneath, something that reminded me of wet carpet in an old house. "So," he said, leaning in close enough that I could see the broken capillaries webbed across his nose. "How long have you two been together?" My boyfriend stared at him. I could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, the calculation of how to handle this without making a scene, without ruining the night more than it had already been ruined. He was 19 years old, sitting across from a man twice his age and twice his size, and I watched him swallow his anger like a stone. "A year," he said quietly. "A year." The man repeated it like he was tasting the word. He nodded slowly, a grin spreading across his face that I did not like at all. "A whole year. Well, that's something. That's really something." He turned to me then, and the grin widened. Up close, his eyes weren't just glassy. They were hungry, not in a way I could point to exactly, not in a way that would hold up if I tried to explain it to someone later, but I felt it, a wrongness, like standing at the edge of a drop you can't see the bottom of. "So tell me," he said, and his voice dropped to something he probably thought was conspiratorial, but was really just grotesque. "You two, you know, are you two active?" The word hung in the air between us like smoke. "Excuse me," I said, "you know what I mean." He winked, actually winked. "Young love and all that. You two getting busy? How's the physical side of things?" My face went hot. Not from embarrassment, though there was that too, from something deeper, a kind of violation that doesn't leave a mark, but makes you feel like something's been taken from you anyway. This stranger, this drunk, sweating stranger, had just reached into the most private corner of our lives and held it up to the light like it was his to examine. My boyfriend's hand found mine under the table. His grip was tight, too tight. I could feel the tremor in his fingers. "That's none of your business," he said, and his voice was steady, but I knew him well enough to hear the fracture lines running through it. The man laughed. That same wet, heavy laugh. "Oh, come on, don't be like that. I'm just making conversation. You're young, you're in love, you're beautiful. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with any of that." He reached into his jacket pocket, and for one bizarre, disorienting moment, I thought he was going to pull out a business card. Instead, he produced a bill, $100 bill. He smoothed it out on the tablecloth between us, with thick, deliberate fingers, pressing out the creases like he was ironing a shirt. "Here's what I think," he said, and his voice had changed again. Lower now, almost reverent, like he was delivering a sermon. "I think you two should take this. Go home tonight and make a baby." The words didn't register at first. They just sat there, absurd and impossible, like a sentence in a language I almost understood but not quite. "Make a baby." He said it the way someone might suggest trying a new restaurant. Casual, certain, like it was the most natural thing in the world for a stranger to say to two teenagers over a half-eaten dinner. "You're out of your mind," my boyfriend said, and he wasn't being polite anymore. The pretense had burned away. His voice was low and hard and shaking. The man didn't flinch. He just pushed the bill closer to me, his fingertip resting on Benjamin Franklin's face. "I'm serious. Look at you two. The world needs more of whatever you are. Take the money. Go home. Do what young people do." "I'm 19, I said. I don't know why I said it. Maybe I thought it would shock him. Maybe I thought if he understood how young I actually was, some switch would flip inside him and he'd realize what he was doing. That he'd see me, really see me, not as some object to project his twisted fantasy onto, but as a kid sitting in a nice restaurant on her anniversary, just trying to have a normal night. He didn't miss a beat, not even half a beat. He leaned back in the chair, and that grin came back, wider and worse than before. And he said, "The Virgin Mary was 14. The sentence landed like a hand around my throat. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I just sat there, staring at him, trying to process what had just come out of his mouth. The casual blasphemy of it. The implication, the way he'd twisted something sacred into a justification for whatever dark, fermented thing was living inside his head. He said it like it was a checkmate. Like he'd won an argument I never agreed to have. The dining room had gone quiet. Not silent, but quiet in that particular way that tells you everyone is listening while pretending not to. Forks had stopped moving. Conversations had thinned to whispers. I could feel the weight of other people's attention pressing against us from every direction, and none of them were doing anything. They were just watching. Spectators at something they didn't want to be part of, but couldn't look away from. My boyfriend stood up. His chair didn't scrape. He rose slowly, deliberately, and he looked down at the man with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something cold and final. "You need to leave," he said. "Right now." The man opened his mouth, but before he could speak, his wife was there. She had crossed the restaurant so quietly, I hadn't even noticed her approach. She appeared at his side like a ghost, her face tight and colorless, and she put her hand on his arm with a grip that looked gentle but wasn't. "Richard," she said, just the name. Nothing else. But the way she said it carried the weight of 1,000 previous nights just like this one. 1,000 restaurants, 1,000 strangers, 1,000 apologies she'd had to make with her eyes because her mouth had run out of words for it years ago. He looked at her. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not shame exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that lived in the same neighborhood but never quite moved in. Then he grunted, pushed himself up from the chair, and let her guide him away. She didn't look at us. She didn't apologize. She just steered him back to their table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this more times than she could count, and within minutes they had settled their bill and were gone. The $100 bill was still on the table. Neither of us touched it. We sat there for a long time after they left. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm around us. Conversations resuming, glasses clinking, the world stitching itself back together as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The air at our table was different now, heavier, bruised. The candle still flickered between us, but the warm golden light that had felt so romantic an hour ago now just felt like it was trying too hard. My boyfriend reached across the table and took my hand again. His grip was softer this time, careful, like he was holding something that might break. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, but I wasn't. Not really. I felt exposed in a way I couldn't articulate. like someone had peeled back a layer of the evening and shown me something underneath that I wasn't supposed to see. Something about the way the world looks at young women when it thinks no one is keeping score. Something about the entitlement that ferments in certain men like alcohol in a barrel, growing stronger and more rancid with every year they go unchallenged. The waiter came by eventually. He was apologetic in that careful, professional way that suggested the restaurant was more worried about a scene than about us. He offered to comp our dessert. We declined. We just wanted to leave. Outside, the night air was cool and clean, and I stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in like I'd been underwater. The street was quiet. A few cars passed, their headlights sweeping across the pavement and then gone. My boyfriend put his arm around me, and I leaned into him, and we stood there for a while without saying anything. I kept thinking about the man's wife. The way she'd sat there through all of it, staring at her plate, the way she'd said his name like a leash she'd pulled so many times the leather had gone soft. I wondered what their car ride home would sound like. I wondered if she'd say anything at all, or if the silence between them was so old and so deep that words couldn't reach the bottom of it anymore. And I kept thinking about what he'd said. That last thing, the Virgin Mary was 14. The way he'd said it without hesitation, without shame, like it was a fact he'd been carrying around in his pocket for years, waiting for the right moment to lay it on the table. I wondered how many times he'd used that line before. How many young women had heard it and felt that same cold hand close around their throat. We never went back to that restaurant. Not because of the food or the service or anything rational like that. We just couldn't. The place had been contaminated. Every time I thought about it, I didn't see the candles or the white tablecloths or my boyfriend's crooked borrowed tie. I saw that man's face, that grin, that $100 bill smoothed flat on the table like a contract I never signed. Some nights, even now, years later, I'll be sitting in a restaurant with someone I love, and the lighting will be just right, warm and golden and soft, and for a moment everything will feel perfect. And then someone at a nearby table will laugh a little too loud, a little too wet, and my whole body will go rigid. Just for a second, just long enough to remember that the world has teeth, and sometimes they find you in the places you feel safest. That $100 bill stayed on the table when we left. I like to think the waiter pocketed it. I like to think someone got something good out of that night. Because we certainly didn't. What we got was a lesson. The kind you don't ask for and can't return. The kind that sits in your chest like a splinter and works its way deeper every time you breathe. We were 19. We were in love. We just wanted one nice night. And a stranger decided it belonged to him. The city had been holding its breath for weeks. Atlanta was the kind of place that never truly went quiet. There was always traffic humming somewhere. Always a siren cutting through the dark. Always the distant pulse of music bleeding out from a bar 2 streets over. But lately, something had changed. A tension had settled over the city like a second skin, invisible but impossible to ignore. 3 women had been found in the past month. 3 women who had simply been going about their lives, leaving work, walking to their cars, doing ordinary things in ordinary places, and then they were gone. Not missing. Gone in the worst possible way. The details had made the local news, then the national news, and now they lived in the back of every woman's mind like a splinter that couldn't be reached. Maya knew all about the murders. Everyone did. She just hadn't expected to feel them so close. It was nearly 10 o'clock when she finally flipped the sign on the salon door from open to closed. The last client had left 40 minutes ago, and her co-workers had trickled out shortly after. One had a kid to pick up, another had a date, and the manager had a family thing she'd been apologizing about all afternoon. Maya had waved them all off. She was the youngest on staff, the newest hire, and she didn't mind staying behind to finish the closing checklist. Sweep the floors, wipe down the stations, count the register, lock up. Simple enough. She'd done it a dozen times before. The salon sat in a strip mall on the edge of a commercial district, the kind of area that was busy and bright during the day, but emptied out fast after sundown. By the time Maya was sweeping the last corner of the floor, the neighboring businesses had gone dark. The nail place next door, the dry cleaner, the little insurance office at the end of the row. One by one, their lights had clicked off, and now the only illumination in the parking lot came from a pair of overhead lamps, both of them casting that particular shade of orange that made everything look slightly wrong. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular when she glanced up through the front window. He was just standing there. At first, her brain tried to make him ordinary. A man waiting for someone, maybe. Someone who'd parked in the lot and was checking his phone. Her eyes moved to him and then away. The way you look at something that doesn't immediately register as a threat. She kept sweeping, but something pulled her gaze back. Some animal instinct that operates below conscious thought. And this time she really looked at him. He was standing at the far edge of the parking lot, just outside the reach of the overhead lights, positioned in a way that felt deliberate. Not pacing, not moving toward a car, not doing anything that people in parking lots normally do. Just standing, watching. He was wearing a surgical mask over the lower half of his face, the kind that had become common enough in recent years that it shouldn't have meant anything. But it was the eye that stopped her cold. Even from across the lot, she could see it, dark and swollen, bruised nearly shut, the skin around it a deep, mottled purple. A black eye. Fresh, by the look of it. Maya set the broom against the wall very slowly, the way you move when you don't want to startle something. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself there were 100 innocent explanations. She told herself the murders had just made her jumpy, that she was projecting danger onto a stranger who was probably harmless. She was good at talking herself down from fear. She'd had practice. But her hands had already gone cold, and her heart was doing something uncomfortable in her chest, and she found that she couldn't quite look away from him. Then he started walking toward the door. His stride was unhurried. That was the thing that frightened her most. She would later realize, not that he rushed, but that he didn't. He walked toward the salon entrance with the calm, measured pace of someone who had already decided how the night was going to go. Maya moved to the door in 3 quick steps and turned the deadbolt. The click of the lock had never sounded so loud. He reached the door and tried the handle. She watched it move, that small, terrible rotation, and then stop. He looked up at her through the glass. The surgical mask hid his mouth, but his one good eye found hers immediately, and something in that gaze made her stomach drop. He raised his hand and knocked, not frantically, not aggressively. Just a polite, patient knock, like a neighbor stopping by to borrow something. Maya didn't move. He knocked again, and then he spoke, his voice muffled but audible through the door. He said he wanted to buy makeup. The salon did not sell makeup. There was no makeup to buy. There had never been makeup for sale. It was a hair salon, nothing more, and the products on the shelves were clearly labeled for hair. Anyone who had ever set foot inside would know that. Anyone who had simply looked through the window at the styling chairs and the mirrors and the rows of shampoo would know this. He knew this too. She was certain of it. Maya took a step back from the door. She kept her face neutral. She didn't know why. Some instinct about not showing fear, about not confirming that she was alone and frightened, and she shook her head slowly. She pointed at the sign. Closed. She mouthed the word. He watched her do it. Then he turned and walked away. And for one brief, treacherous moment, she felt relief. It lasted about 4 seconds. She moved to the side window, angling herself so she could see without being easily seen, and she watched him. He didn't go to a car. He didn't walk to the street. He crossed the parking lot at that same unhurried pace and stepped into the shadow behind a row of overgrown bushes at the far edge of the property, the kind of landscaping that nobody ever maintained, thick and dark and tall enough to hide a person completely. He didn't come back out. Maya stood very still and tried to think clearly. Her phone was in her apron pocket. She could call someone. She should call someone. But she also knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely, that if she was still inside this building when he decided to stop waiting, a phone call wasn't going to help her fast enough. The back door was an option. It opened onto a narrow alley between the strip mall and the building behind it, but she didn't know what was in that alley, and the thought of stepping into a dark, enclosed space she couldn't see into felt worse than staying put. She watched the bushes. Nothing moved. Minutes passed. She couldn't have said how many. Time had gone strange and elastic, the way it does when your body is running on adrenaline and your mind is trying to calculate odds. She kept her eyes on that dark cluster of shrubs, and she thought about the 3 women. She thought about how ordinary their nights had probably seemed, right up until they weren't. Then she saw him again. He had moved. He was no longer behind the bushes, he was closer now, near the edge of the building, partially visible in the orange light. He was looking at the door, just looking at it, the way you look at something you're waiting to open. His posture hadn't changed. He wasn't agitated. He wasn't impatient. He was simply waiting, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed that eventually she would have to come out. Maya made her decision. She grabbed her bag from behind the counter, her keys already in her hand. She'd been gripping them so tightly that the teeth had left marks in her palm. She took 3 deep breaths. She thought about the distance from the door to her car, which was parked maybe 30 feet away, slightly to the left. She thought about the angle. She thought about whether she could get there before he could close the gap. She unlocked the door and she ran. Not a jog, not a hurried walk. She ran, the way you run when something is behind you, when every nerve in your body is screaming. The night air hit her face, and she heard the sound of her own footsteps on the asphalt, and she did not look back. Not once, because she knew that if she looked back, she might slow down, and slowing down was not something she could afford. She hit the car door, got the key in the lock on the second try, threw herself inside, and had the engine running before the door was fully closed. She pulled out of the lot fast, tires loud on the pavement, and she drove. It was only when she was several blocks away, stopped at a red light with her hands shaking on the wheel, that she finally let herself breathe. She sat there in the red glow and she thought about his eye. That bruised, swollen eye above the surgical mask. She thought about the way he'd tried the door handle, the way he'd knocked, so calmly, the way he'd hidden in the bushes and waited, and then moved closer, and waited some more. She thought about what would have happened if she'd stayed inside until she felt safe enough to leave. She thought about the 3 women. Maya drove home with every light in her car on and every door locked, and she didn't stop shaking for a very long time. There was something wrong with the way Rick smiled. That was the first thing Maya noticed, not the staring itself, which she could have dismissed as coincidence, but the smile that came with it. Slow, patient, like he had already decided something about her and was simply waiting for her to catch up. She had worked the warehouse floor for 3 years before Rick transferred in from the Eastern distribution. He was quiet in the way that certain men are quiet, not out of shyness, but out of calculation. He watched, he waited, and from the very first week, he watched her. It started at the loading dock. Maya would back her delivery truck into Bay 7, kill the engine, and climb down to begin her route prep. And there he would be, standing just inside the bay entrance, arms loose at his sides, that slow smile already in place, not doing anything, not saying anything, just standing there, watching her move through her checklist like she was something on a screen. She told herself it was nothing. Men stared. It was unpleasant, but it was nothing. She focused on her clipboard, on her packages, on the route ahead. She kept her eyes down and her pace brisk, and she told herself it would stop. It didn't stop. It got worse in the way that these things always get worse, gradually, then all at once. He started positioning himself closer, not dramatically, not in a way she could easily point to and say, look at what he's doing. Just a few feet nearer each time. Close enough that she could hear him breathing when she passed. Close enough that she had to angle her body away from him just to reach her own equipment. And still, that smile. That patient, unhurried smile. The first time he trapped her, she almost convinced herself it was an accident. She had climbed into the back of her truck to reorganize a stack of parcels that had shifted during the previous run. The cargo bay was dim and close, smelling of cardboard and industrial tape. She heard footsteps on the dock behind her, and then the light from the bay entrance narrowed as Rick stepped up into the truck's threshold and leaned against the frame, blocking the way out. She straightened, looked at him. He smiled. "Need something?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let her stand there in the half-dark with nowhere to go, and then he said something about her uniform, about the way it fit. His voice was low and conversational, like he was commenting on the weather, like what he was saying was perfectly ordinary. Maya felt the floor of her stomach drop out. She pushed past him. She made herself move like she wasn't afraid, made herself walk at a normal pace back toward the main floor, and she did not look back. But she could feel his eyes on her the entire way, and the smile, she didn't have to see it to know it was still there. After that, it became a pattern. He would find her in the trucks, always when she was alone, always when the dock was quiet, always when there was no easy witness. He would block the exit with his body and stand there, and he would talk to her in that low, casual voice about her body, about the way she moved, about things she never asked to hear and could not unhear. And sometimes he would reach out, just a poke, just a finger against her arm or her shoulder, light enough to be deniable, deliberate enough to make her skin crawl for hours afterward. She started checking the dock before she climbed into any truck. She started leaving the cargo doors open even when it slowed her down. She started timing her route prep to avoid the moments when the floor was emptiest. She rearranged her entire working life around the geography of his threat, and still he found her. The fear had a texture by then. It wasn't sharp and sudden anymore. It was low and constant, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing, something you couldn't quite name but couldn't stop feeling. She would lie awake at night running through the next day's schedule, mapping out the spaces where he might appear, rehearsing what she would say, what she would do. She stopped eating lunch in the break room. She stopped taking the shortcut through Bay 7. She reported it to her supervisor on a Tuesday morning, standing in his office with her hands folded in her lap, and her voice very careful and controlled. She told him everything, the staring, the blocking, the comments, the touching. She told him how long it had been going on. She watched his face as she spoke, trying to read whether he believed her, whether it mattered, whether anything was going to change. He told her he would look into it. The security footage told the story more plainly than words could. Camera after camera, bay after bay, the recordings showed Rick positioning himself at truck entrances, leaning into the frames, following Maya's movements with that same patient attention. The investigators watched him block her exit. They watched him lean in close. They watched the moment she pushed past him, the way her body was angled away, the speed of her retreat. They fired him within the week. Maya stood at her truck on the morning after she got the news, clipboard in hand, and looked out at the empty bay entrance. The dock was loud with the ordinary sounds of the warehouse, forklifts, voices, the hydraulic sigh of loading equipment, normal sounds. Sounds she had stopped being able to hear as normal for a long time. She climbed into the cab. She started the engine. She checked the mirrors before she pulled out, a habit she'd always had, a professional reflex. But this time, when she looked, there was nothing behind her but the open dock and the pale morning light coming in through the bay doors. Just that, nothing more. She pulled out onto the route and drove. The first time I satisfying him, I was 16 years old. I didn't know his name. I didn't know where he came from. All I knew was the feeling, that cold, crawling sensation on the back of my neck that told me someone was watching, someone close, someone who had no intention of looking away. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray, forgettable day that blurs into every other day when you're a teenager just trying to get home from school. I was waiting at the bus stop on Greenfield Road, earbuds in, backpack slung over one shoulder, scrolling through my phone without really seeing anything on the screen. The bus was late. It was always late. And the shelter smelled like wet concrete and old cigarettes. And there were only two other people waiting, an elderly woman clutching a canvas shopping bag and a man. He was standing about 10 feet away. Early 30s, maybe. Medium build. Brown jacket. Nothing about him should have stood out. But something did. Something I couldn't name at first. It was the way he was standing, not quite facing me, but angled just enough that I could feel his attention locked onto the side of my face like a beam of heat. I glanced up once, just a flicker of a look, and caught his eyes before he turned away. He smiled, not at me, exactly. More like he smiled to himself, like I'd just confirmed something he already suspected. The bus came. I got on first, tapped my card, and moved toward the back. I always sat near the back. I dropped into a window seat, pressed my temple against the cold glass, and watched the street slide by. And then I heard it. The soft exhale of someone sitting down right behind me, not across the aisle, not a few rows back, directly behind me, close enough that I could hear the fabric of his jacket shift against the seat. I turned around. It was him, the man from the bus stop. He was looking straight at me now. And this time he didn't look away. He smiled again, wider, and said, "Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?" My stomach dropped. Not because the line was clever. It wasn't. It was the most generic thing a stranger could say. But it was the way he said it. Calm, certain. Like he genuinely believed he had a right to my attention. Like this was a conversation I had already agreed to. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Just that. One word." I turned back around and stared at my phone, but the screen was a blur. My pulse was loud in my ears. I could still feel him behind me, the warmth of his presence pressing against the back of my seat like a hand hovering just above my shoulder. He didn't say anything else. Not on the bus. But when I got off at my stop, 3 blocks from home, I heard the hiss of the doors opening a second time behind me. I looked back. He was stepping off the bus too. Same stop, same sidewalk, same direction. I walked faster. He kept pace. Not running, not closing the distance, just maintaining it, like a shadow stitched to my heels. I ducked into a corner shop, the little one with the bell above the door and the Pakistani owner who knew my mum by name. I pretended to browse the crisps aisle, and I watched the door. He didn't come in. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. When I finally stepped outside, the street was empty. He was gone. I told myself it was nothing. A coincidence. A weird guy on a weird day. I was 16. I didn't yet have the language for what had happened. I didn't know the word predator. I didn't know that what I had felt, that sick, electric awareness of being chosen, was something other women carried in their bones like an old fracture that never quite healed. I forgot about him, or I thought I did. 5 years passed. I finished school. I got a job. I moved into a flat with a friend. I became someone who walked through the world with a little more confidence, a little more steel in her spine. I stopped flinching at footsteps behind me. I stopped checking over my shoulder every time I stepped off a bus. And then, on an ordinary Wednesday evening, he came back. I was at the same bus stop, not because I still lived nearby. I'd been visiting my mum, helping her sort through boxes in the attic, and I'd taken the old route of habit. The shelter hadn't changed. Same cracked bench. Same faded timetable behind scratched plastic. Same smell of wet concrete. I was standing there, 21 years old now, scrolling through my phone when the air shifted. I can't explain it any other way. The air shifted. Like the temperature dropped half a degree. Like the sounds of the street, the cars, the birds, the distant thrum of a lawnmower, all pulled back by 1 notch. And in the silence that opened up, I felt it again. That gaze, that heavy, deliberate attention settling onto me like a hand pressing down on the top of my head. I looked up, and there he was. Same man, 5 years older, but unmistakable. The same medium build, the same angle of his body, not quite facing me, but oriented toward me like a satellite dish finding its signal. He was standing at the other end of the shelter, maybe 12 feet away, and he was watching me with an expression that made my blood go cold. It was recognition, not the vague, uncertain kind you get when you see someone who looks familiar. This was specific. This was certain. He knew exactly who I was. The bus arrived. I got on. I sat near the middle this time, not the back, and I kept my eyes on the aisle. He boarded after me. He walked past my row, and for a moment I thought he would keep going, but he stopped. He sat down 1 row behind me, on the opposite side, and I could feel him the way you feel a draft from an open window, constant, directional, impossible to ignore. He leaned forward. "I know you," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "We've met before, haven't we?" The words were identical, the exact same opening line, delivered with the exact same calm certainty, as if 5 years hadn't passed, as if I were still 16, as if this were simply the next sentence in a conversation he had never stopped having in his head. I didn't answer. I stared straight ahead and gripped my phone so hard the case creaked. My mind was racing. 5 years. He remembered my face after 5 years. That meant he hadn't forgotten. That meant he had carried my image around with him, stored it somewhere accessible, kept it polished and ready. The thought made my skin crawl in a way I cannot adequately describe. It was like discovering that someone had been living in your attic, sleeping above your ceiling, breathing your air, and you had never known. He tried again. "Come on, don't be like that. I'm sure we've met. You look so familiar." He laughed softly, a warm, disarming sound that was engineered to put me at ease. It did the opposite. It made every hair on my arm stand straight up. I got off at my usual stop, the one near the row of shops where I sometimes picked up groceries. He got off too. Same stop, same sidewalk, same direction. The pattern was repeating, beat for beat, like a song I had heard before and prayed I would never hear again. I walked into the supermarket. Not the corner shop this time, but the big one, the bright one with the fluorescent lights and the security cameras and the other people pushing trolleys and arguing about cereal. I thought the crowd would deter him. I thought the lights would make him shrink back. I was wrong. He followed me inside. He grabbed a basket, as if he had always intended to shop here, and he appeared at the end of every aisle I turned down. Bread aisle. There he was. Frozen foods. There he was. Tinned vegetables. There he was, holding a can of tomatoes he had no intention of buying, smiling at me like we were old friends, bumping into each other by happy accident. And then he escalated. I was standing at the self-checkout, scanning a box of pasta, when he walked up beside me and placed a bottle of wine on the counter next to my things. "Let me get this for you," he said. "We can open it at mine. I live just around the corner. We can catch up, as if we had history, as if we had ever exchanged more than a single, unwanted sentence." The audacity of it, the sheer, breathtaking entitlement, broke something loose inside me. The fear was still there, coiled tight in my chest, but something else rose up beside it, something hot and sharp and absolutely finished with being polite. I turned to face him fully for the first time. I looked him dead in the eyes, and I said, loud enough for the people at the neighboring checkouts to hear, "I don't know you. I have never known you. You followed me onto a bus 5 years ago when I was 16 years old, and you are doing the exact same thing right now. Stop following me. Stop talking to me. Leave me alone." The supermarket went quiet. Not completely, but enough. The woman at the next checkout stopped scanning. A man in a high-visibility vest near the door looked over. The cashier at the manned till straightened up. And the man, my shadow, my recurring nightmare, did something I will never forget. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He looked annoyed, mildly, briefly annoyed, like I had broken a rule in a game only he knew we were playing, like I had spoiled his fun. He picked up his bottle of wine, tucked it under his arm, and walked out without a word. No apology, no denial, no shock at being accused. Just that flicker of irritation, and then gone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely finish scanning my groceries. The woman at the next checkout touched my arm and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I wasn't. I wasn't okay at all, because I had just realized something that made the ground feel unsteady beneath my feet. He had remembered me. After 5 years, he had remembered my face, my bus stop, my route. He had recognized me instantly, the way you recognize a possession you misplaced and then found again. I called my brother from the car park. He came within 15 minutes, and he walked me home. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way, scanning every doorway, every parked car, every shadow between the streetlights. The man was nowhere, but that was almost worse, because nowhere didn't mean gone. Nowhere just meant I couldn't see him. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things that had to be true for this encounter to have happened. He had to have remembered my face for 5 years. He had to have been in the same area, riding the same buses, walking the same streets. He had to have seen me and felt that same sick pull, that same sense of ownership, and decided to try again, not impulsively, not drunkenly, deliberately, patiently, like a hunter returning to a spot where he once saw deer. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake until the sky turned gray, was the question I couldn't answer. How many times had he seen me in those 5 years without me seeing him? How many times had he been on the same bus, in the same shop, on the same street, watching from a distance I couldn't feel? How many times had he almost approached and decided to wait? I don't know his name. I never learned it. I never saw him again after that night, though I looked for him constantly for months, scanning every crowd, every bus, every queue at every checkout. He became a ghost, which is exactly what he had always been. A ghost that wore a brown jacket and smiled like he knew you. A ghost that remembered your face for half a decade and came back to claim what he believed was his. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt that feeling, that cold, crawling certainty that someone is watching you, trust it. Don't rationalize it. Don't tell yourself you're being paranoid. Don't wait for proof. The proof is the feeling itself. Your body knows things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. It knows when you're being hunted. It has always known. And if you're the kind of person who follows strangers onto buses and into shops and tells yourself it's harmless, that it's flattering, that she should be grateful for the attention, let me be very clear. She is not flattered. She is not grateful. She is afraid, and she will remember your face for the rest of her life, the same way you remembered hers. The difference is, she remembers it the way you remember a nightmare, and you remember it the way you remember a meal you never got to finish. That is not romance. That is not persistence. That is predation. And the only reason it doesn't always end in tragedy is luck. Blind, stupid, undeserved luck. And luck, as every woman knows, is not a thing you can count on twice. The night she turned 18, something followed her home. Not a person exactly, not at first. It was more like a feeling, the kind that starts at the base of your skull and trickles down your spine like ice water. She had walked this route 1,000 times before, cutting through the neighborhood streets after her evening shift at the diner, her sneakers scuffing against the same cracked sidewalks she had known since childhood. The houses on her block were all dark by that hour. Porch lights clicked off, curtains drawn tight. The whole street surrendered to sleep. She usually liked the quiet. It made the world feel like it belonged to her alone. But that night, something was different. She noticed it from almost a full block away. A van, white and windowless, parked directly in front of her house. It sat beneath the broken streetlight, the one the city had never bothered to fix, and it seemed to absorb the darkness around it. No markings on the side, no company logo, no license plate light, just a blank, featureless shape, crouching at the curb like something waiting to be fed. She slowed her pace without meaning to. Her body understood the danger before her mind caught up. There was a figure inside the van, sitting behind the steering wheel. She could just barely make out the silhouette through the windshield. A head and shoulders, perfectly still, facing her direction. The engine was off. The headlights were off. But the person inside was wide awake. She stopped walking. For a long, terrible moment, she stood in the middle of the sidewalk and tried to convince herself it was nothing. A neighbor's friend, a delivery driver taking a break, someone checking their phone. But no glow lit up the interior. No cigarette ember pulsed in the dark. The figure was simply sitting there, in a cold and lightless vehicle, staring out through the glass at the empty street. Staring at her, her heart began to hammer. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, in her throat, behind her eyes. Every instinct she had, every ancient alarm buried deep in the wiring of her brain, began to scream the same word over and over. Wrong, 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 wrong. There was a large oak tree about 20 feet to her left, set back from the sidewalk on a neighbor's lawn. Its trunk was wide enough to hide behind, thick enough to break the line of sight between her and that windshield. She didn't run to it. Running felt dangerous, like it would trigger something, like sudden movement might flip a switch inside whoever was watching her. Instead, she stepped sideways, slowly, carefully, the way you might back away from an animal you weren't sure about, and she pressed herself against the rough bark of the tree. She could still see the van from where she stood, and the driver could still see her, or at least the edge of her, one eye peering around the trunk. She didn't look away. She couldn't. Some deep, primal part of her understood that breaking eye contact would be a mistake, that as long as she was watching him, he couldn't move without her knowing. It was the only power she had in that moment, the power of witness, and she held on to it with everything she had. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. The neighborhood was so quiet she could hear the faint ticking of the van's cooling engine, the rustle of leaves above her head, the distant hum of a highway she couldn't see. Her legs began to ache from standing rigid. Her fingers dug into the bark until splinters bit into her skin. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She watched, and he watched back. She could feel his gaze even through the darkness, even through the glass. It had a weight to it, a texture, like something damp pressing against her skin. She had never in her life felt so completely seen by something she couldn't fully see, and the asymmetry of it made her stomach turn. He knew exactly what he was looking at. She was only guessing at the shape of him. Then, after what might have been 5 minutes or might have been 20, the van's engine turned over. The sound split the silence like a crack in bone. The headlights stayed off. The van pulled away from the curb slowly, almost reluctantly, and rolled down the street in the direction it had been facing. She watched its taillights, dim and red, shrink into the distance until they disappeared around the corner. She didn't wait. She ran. She crossed the lawn in 3 strides, fumbled her keys out of her jacket pocket with shaking hands, and nearly broke the lock jamming the key in sideways before she got the door open. She threw herself inside, slammed it shut, twisted the deadbolt, and slid the chain into place. Then she pressed her back against the door and stood there in the dark hallway, breathing so hard her ribs ached. The house was silent. Her parents were asleep upstairs. The hallway clock ticked its steady, indifferent rhythm. She was safe. She was inside. It was over. Except it wasn't. She moved to the front window, the one that looked out onto the street, and parted the curtain just enough to see through with one eye. The street was empty. The broken streetlight flickered once, casting a brief orange pulse across the pavement, then went dark again. She exhaled. Her hands were still trembling. She told herself to go upstairs, to lock her bedroom door, to crawl under the covers and forget about it. Then the van came back. It rolled into view from the far end of the street, moving slowly, almost drifting, its headlights still off. It passed her house without stopping, and she watched it glide by like a pale shark cutting through black water. It reached the end of the block, paused at the stop sign for a beat too long, then turned around and came back. This time it moved even slower. She could see the driver's silhouette again, that same dark shape behind the wheel, and his head was turning, scanning the sidewalks, the lawns, the spaces between houses. He was looking for her. He drove past again, and again. Each pass was slower than the last, each one more deliberate, more searching. She counted 4 passes before she finally let the curtain fall and backed away from the window. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor with her back against the wall. Her knees pulled up to her chest, her hands clamped over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She sat there for a long time, listening to the van's engine fade and return, like the breathing of something enormous circling her house. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity folded into a single suffocating hour, the sound faded one last time and didn't come back. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bedroom floor with her back against the door and her phone in her hand. The screen locked on the keypad with 911 already typed in, her thumb hovering over the call button until the sky outside her window turned gray, and then pink, and then gold. In the morning, the street looked exactly the way it always did. Sprinklers hissing on lawns, a neighbor walking a dog, sunlight pouring over everything like a coat of paint designed to cover up what had been there in the dark. She stood at the window and stared at the spot where the van had been parked, and there was nothing there. No tire marks, no oil stain, nothing to prove that any of it had happened at all. She never walked home at night again. She got rides. She changed her schedule. She rearranged her entire life around the simple, unshakable certainty that something had been waiting for her in that van, and that the only reason she was still standing in her kitchen drinking coffee on a Tuesday morning was because she had stopped walking when every part of her wanted to keep going, because she had hidden instead of hurrying, because she had watched him watching her, and in doing so, had made herself just difficult enough to take. And sometimes, late at night, When she was lying in bed and the house was quiet and the street outside was dark, she would hear an engine idling somewhere in the distance, low and patient, and she would hold her breath and listen until it passed. It always passed, but she never stopped listening for the night it wouldn't. She was 16 years old, standing alone in a bus shelter on a gray Tuesday morning, and she had no idea that the next few minutes would become the kind of memory that never fully leaves your body. The shelter was one of those small plexiglass boxes on the side of a suburban road, barely big enough for two people to stand in without touching shoulders. It smelled like old rain and exhaust fumes. The bench inside was cracked down the middle, and someone had scratched something obscene into the fogged plastic wall. It was the kind of place you wait in without really thinking about it, just another forgettable pause between home and school, between one ordinary moment and the next. She had her backpack slung over one shoulder and her phone in her hand, scrolling through nothing in particular, half watching the road for the bus. The street was quiet. A few cars drifted past without slowing. The houses across the road had their curtains drawn. There was no one else at the stop, no one walking on the sidewalk, no one mowing a lawn or pulling out of a driveway. Just her, the shelter, and the low hum of a morning that hadn't fully woken up yet. She didn't hear him approach. That was the detail that would bother her most when she thought about it later. The fact that she never heard footsteps, never caught the sound of a car door opening or closing, never had that small window of warning that might have let her step out of the shelter and onto the open sidewalk before it was too late. One moment she was alone, and the next moment there was a shadow filling the entrance of the shelter, and a man was standing right there, close enough that she could smell him. He was large. That was the first thing her brain registered. Not his face, not his clothes, just the sheer physical size of him. He was tall and broad across the chest and shoulders, the kind of build that made the bus shelter feel like a coffin. He stood directly in the opening, the only way in or out, and he placed one hand on each side of the frame, his arms forming a barrier that turned the small space into a cage. She looked up at him. Her phone screen went dark in her hand. He smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that was meant to look friendly but didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were flat and watchful, scanning her face the way someone might look at an object they were deciding whether to pick up. "Hey there," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, like he was talking to a nervous animal. "You waiting for the bus?" She nodded. She didn't speak. Something in her chest had gone tight, a wire pulling taut between her ribs, and her body understood the danger before her conscious mind had fully caught up. Every instinct she had was firing at once, telling her that something about this interaction was deeply, fundamentally wrong, but her thoughts were still scrambling to find a rational explanation. Maybe he was just being friendly, maybe he was a parent from the neighborhood, maybe he needed directions, but he wasn't moving. He wasn't stepping aside. His arms stayed exactly where they were, locked against the frame of the shelter, and his body filled the opening completely. She could not get past him without touching him, and some ancient, primal part of her brain understood exactly what that meant. "Bus is probably running late," he said, tilting his head slightly. "They always run late on this route. I've seen kids standing out here for 30, 40 minutes sometimes. That's a long time to wait by yourself." She said nothing. Her fingers had gone cold around her phone. "Tell you what," he continued, and his smile widened just a fraction. "My car's right over there." He nodded toward the road without taking his hands off the frame. "I can give you a ride to school. Get you there on time. No sense standing out here in the cold." She shook her head. The motion was small and automatic, barely more than a twitch. "No thank you," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she wanted it to. "The bus will be here soon." He didn't move. The smile didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of something harder, something impatient, like a mask slipping just slightly out of place before being pressed back into position. "Come on," he said. "It's no trouble. I drive past the high school every morning anyway. You'd be doing me a favor, honestly. I hate driving alone." "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." There was a pause, a long one. The air inside the shelter felt thick and stale, and she became suddenly, painfully aware of how small the space was. how close he was standing, how the plexiglass walls behind her and on either side offered no exit, no escape route, nothing but a dead end. She was boxed in. The only way out was through him. He dropped his arms from the frame. For one brief, desperate second, she thought he was going to step aside, that whatever this was had passed, that he had read her refusal and accepted it, and was going to walk back to his car and drive away and become nothing more than an uncomfortable story she would tell her friends at lunch. Instead, he lunged forward. His hand closed around her arm just above the elbow, and his grip was shockingly strong. Fingers digging into the soft tissue hard enough to leave marks she would still be able to see 3 days later. He pulled her toward him, toward the opening of the shelter, toward the road where his car was waiting with the engine still running. And in that instant, every polite, socialized instinct she had been raised with evaporated completely, and was replaced by something raw and electric and absolutely furious. She fought. She didn't think about it. She didn't plan it. Her body simply erupted into motion, twisting and pulling and wrenching her arm against the weakest point of his grip, the gap between his thumb and fingers, just like her mother had shown her once in the kitchen when she was 12, a casual self-defense tip delivered over pasta sauce that neither of them ever expected to matter. She yanked her arm back and down with everything she had, and at the same time she drove her other hand into his chest, not a punch exactly, more of a shove, a desperate creation of space between his body and hers. He stumbled, not much, half a step, but it was enough to break his grip for just a moment, and in that moment, she heard something that sounded like salvation. The bus. She heard it before she saw it. The heavy diesel groan of the engine, the hiss of air brakes, the familiar mechanical rhythm that she had heard 1,000 mornings without ever once feeling grateful for it. She twisted sideways, ducked under his arm, and threw herself out of the shelter and onto the sidewalk just as the bus pulled up to the curb with a long, shuddering exhale. She didn't look back. She ran to the bus doors and pounded on them before they had fully opened, and when they parted, she climbed the steps 2 at a time and pushed past the driver and collapsed into the first empty seat she could find. Her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't hold her phone. Her arm throbbed where his fingers had been. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts that she tried to muffle against the sleeve of her jacket because there were other students on the bus, and she didn't want them to see her like this, didn't want to explain, didn't want to make it real by saying it out loud. Through the window, she watched the man walk back to his car. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. He moved with the calm, unhurried pace of someone who had done this before and fully intended to do it again. He got into the driver's seat, closed the door, and pulled away from the curb without looking back at the bus. She memorized his car. The color, the make, the shape of the taillights as they disappeared down the road. She burned every detail into her mind with a ferocity that surprised her, because even through the fear and the adrenaline and the sick, shaky feeling spreading through her stomach, some part of her understood that remembering was the most important thing she could do. She told her parents that evening. They called the police. An officer came to the house and took her statement, writing everything down in a small notebook while her mother sat beside her on the couch and held her hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The officer was kind. He asked careful questions. He told her she had done everything right. But she could see something in his expression that he was trying to hide, a tightness around his mouth, a weight behind his eyes, and she understood that what had happened to her was not an isolated incident. She was not the first girl he had heard this story from. A week passed, 7 days of jumping at shadows, of scanning every car that slowed near a crosswalk, of standing at the bus stop with her back pressed against the outer wall of the shelter so she could see in every direction at once. 7 days of replaying the moment in the shelter over and over, feeling his hand on her arm, hearing his voice, seeing that flat, patient look in his eyes. 7 days of wondering if he was out there somewhere, waiting at another bus stop, smiling at another girl. Then the phone rang. The detective asked her to come to the station. They had something they wanted her to look at. She sat in a small room with fluorescent lights and a table that wobbled slightly on one leg, and they placed a book of photographs in front of her. Mugshots, page after page of men's faces staring blankly at the camera, and she turned each page with steady hands even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She found him on the 4th page. She knew him instantly. The broad face, the heavy brow, the flat, watchful eyes that looked at you like you were something to be collected. She put her finger on the photograph and said, "That's him," and her voice didn't shake at all. The detective nodded slowly. He closed the book and sat back in his chair and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. The man in the photograph was already known to them. He had a history, a pattern, a trail of incidents stretching back years. He targeted young girls, teenagers mostly, approaching them in isolated spots, bus stops, parking lots, quiet stretches of sidewalk where no one was watching. He was careful. He was patient. He chose his moments with the precision of a predator who had learned through practice exactly how to separate a target from safety. But he had finally made a mistake. Just days before she sat in that room, identifying his photograph, the man had been pulled over during a routine traffic stop. When the officer approached the vehicle, he found the driver nervous and evasive, and when he looked into the back seat, he found a girl. She was young, younger than 16, and she was not there willingly. The man was arrested on the spot. The girl was recovered, and now, with a positive identification linking him to yet another attempted abduction, the case against him was growing into something he would never be able to talk his way out of. She walked out of the police station into the afternoon sunlight and stood on the steps for a moment, breathing. The air smelled like cut grass and warm asphalt, ordinary smells, safe smells, and she filled her lungs with them and held the breath until her chest ached. She thought about the girl they found in his car. She thought about how close she herself had come to being in that back seat. She thought about the bus arriving at exactly the right moment. The grip she broke with a move her mother taught her years ago over a pot of simmering sauce. The way her body had known what to do even when her mind was frozen with fear. She thought about all the moments that had to align perfectly for her to be standing here right now, in the sunlight, breathing, alive and free and whole. And she thought about the fact that he had done this before, that there were other bus stops, other shelters, other girls who might not have fought back, who might not have had a bus arriving at just the right second, who might not have had a mother, who once casually demonstrated how to break a grip while stirring marinara. She was 16 years old, and she understood something that most people spend their entire lives trying not to think about. The world is full of small, ordinary places where terrible things can happen in broad daylight, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and the worst moment of your life is your own refusal to stop fighting. She went home. She hugged her mother for a very long time, and she never waited inside that bus shelter again. Something was wrong inside the house long before they could prove it. It started with small things, the kind of details you dismiss because admitting they matter means admitting something far worse. A coffee mug moved from the left side of the counter to the right. A bathroom towel rehung on a different hook than the one you always use. The blinds in the living room tilted at an angle no one remembered touching. 3 young women living together near a college campus, sharing the comfortable chaos of early adulthood, and not one of them could explain why their home kept feeling slightly rearranged, like someone had been standing in their spaces and carefully putting everything back, just a fraction of an inch off from where it belonged. At first, they blamed each other. That is always the first instinct when you share a house. Someone borrows a hair tie and forgets to mention it. Someone shifts the blinds to let in light and doesn't think about it again. Someone moves a charger from one room to another. These are the ordinary frictions of cohabitation, and for a while, that explanation held. It was easier to believe in carelessness than to consider the alternative, because the alternative meant that someone else had been inside their home, someone who did not live there, someone who had no right to touch their things, to breathe their air, to stand in their rooms while they were gone and handle their belongings with slow, deliberate hands. The first real crack in that comfortable denial came when one of the women opened her dresser drawer and found that several small items were missing. Nothing expensive. Nothing that would trigger an insurance claim or a frantic search. Just personal things. The kind of objects that hold no value to anyone except the person who owns them. A particular lip balm, a hair clip she wore almost every day, a small bottle of lotion that had been half full the last time she used it. Gone, not misplaced, not buried under other things in the drawer, simply absent, as though they had never existed at all. she asked her roommates. Neither of them had touched the drawer. Neither of them had borrowed anything. And that was the moment the air inside the house changed. Because now the strangeness had a texture to it, a weight that pressed against the walls and made every familiar corner feel like it was hiding something just out of sight. They started paying closer attention after that. And paying closer attention is a dangerous thing when you live in a place that might not be entirely yours anymore. Every creak in the floorboards became a question. Every draft from an unknown source became a whisper of possibility. They began checking the locks obsessively, testing the doors and windows before bed, tugging on handles they had already tugged on 5 minutes earlier. And still, things kept happening. The blinds kept moving. Objects kept shifting. The house kept offering them these tiny, maddening clues that someone was threading themselves through the fabric of their daily lives with a patience that bordered on devotion. Then came the discovery that turned suspicion into visceral, skin-crawling certainty. One of the roommates pulled open her clothing drawer, the same drawer where items had gone missing, and noticed a smell. It was faint at first, just an undertone beneath the familiar scent of laundry detergent and fabric softener. But it was there, unmistakable once her mind identified it. Acidic, warm, biological. She lifted a folded shirt and the odor intensified, rising from the fabric in a wave that made her stomach lurch. The clothing was damp in places it should not have been damp, and the stain spreading through the cotton was not water. It was not a spilled drink. It was not anything that belonged in a dresser drawer inside a young woman's bedroom. It was urine, human urine, soaked deliberately into her clothes, folded neatly back into place, and left for her to find. The violation of that moment is almost impossible to overstate. This was not a burglary. Nothing of monetary value had been taken. This was not vandalism in any conventional sense. This was something far more intimate and far more disturbing. Someone had entered their home, gone to her bedroom, opened her private drawer, handled her clothing, and left a part of themselves behind. A biological signature, a mark of territory, a message that said, without words, I was here. I was in your most private space. I touched what belongs to you, and you had no idea. The three women sat together that evening and tried to reconstruct a timeline. When could this have happened? How long had it been going on? Who had access to their home? The doors had been locked. The windows had been secured. There was no sign of forced entry, no scratches on the locks, no broken latches, no shattered glass. Whoever was coming inside was not breaking in. They were walking in. They had the codes. They knew the system. They moved through the house like someone who had been there many times before, someone who understood the layout so well they could navigate it in the dark, touch what they wanted, leave what they wanted, and disappear before anyone returned. And that was when the conversation turned to their neighbor. He lived close enough to see their front door, close enough to hear their cars start in the morning and pull into the driveway at night. Over the preceding weeks, he had demonstrated a familiarity with their schedules that no casual observer should possess. He knew when they left for class. He knew when they came home. He made comments that revealed an awareness of their comings and goings so precise it felt rehearsed, as though he had been keeping a log, marking times, noting patterns, building a map of their lives that allowed him to predict exactly when the house would be empty and exactly how long he would have inside. The women described his behavior as obsessive. Not aggressive in the way that triggers an immediate alarm, but persistent in the way that slowly tightens around you like a wire. He would appear at odd moments. He would mention details about their routines that they had never shared with him. He would linger in conversations just long enough to extract information and then retreat, always watching, always cataloging. It was the kind of fixation that hides behind politeness, that disguises itself as friendliness or neighborly concern, and by the time you recognize it for what it truly is, it has already woven itself so deeply into your daily existence that extracting it feels impossible. They could not yet prove he was the one entering their home. They had no footage. They had no fingerprints. They had only the circumstantial architecture of his knowledge, the missing items, the moved blinds, the urine-soaked clothing, and the suffocating certainty that someone who knew their lives this intimately was not learning it from a distance. So they decided to build a trap. They began installing cameras throughout the house, small and discreet, positioned to cover every entry point and every room where disturbances had occurred. They aimed lenses at the front door, the back door, the hallways, the bedrooms. They set up motion-activated recordings so that any movement inside the house while they were gone would be captured and time-stamped and stored where no intruder could erase it. They changed every access code, every digital lock combination, every entry sequence that anyone outside their household might have learned or observed or stolen. They told no one the new codes. They shared them only with each other, spoken aloud in whispers inside the house, never written down, never texted, never left anywhere a watching eye could intercept them. And then they waited. The cameras watched the empty rooms. The new codes guarded the doors. The house sat in silence during the hours they were away, and somewhere in that silence, the answer was either forming or retreating. Either the intruder would return, confident in routines and access that no longer existed, and walk directly into a web of evidence that would finally give the violation a face and a name. Or the intruder would sense the shift, notice the new cameras, realize the codes had changed, and pull back into the shadows to wait for a different kind of opportunity. The women understood both possibilities. They understood that catching a phroger, someone who secretly inhabits or repeatedly enters another person's living space, is not like catching a thief. A thief wants your possessions. A phroger wants your presence. They want proximity to your life. They want to exist inside your routines, to touch the objects you touch, to breathe the air still warm from your body, to stand in the spaces you occupy and feel the ghost of your existence around them. It is a hunger that does not diminish when you change the locks. It adapts. It finds new cracks. It waits. Every night, the three of them lay in their beds knowing that the cameras were recording, knowing that the codes had been changed, knowing that they had done everything within their power to secure the space around them. And every night, the house settled into its familiar sounds, the ticking of pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft groan of wood contracting in the cool air, and each sound carried a question they could not yet answer. Was someone still finding a way inside? Were they alone in the dark? Or was someone standing just beyond the reach of the cameras, patient and practiced and utterly still, watching the red recording lights blink in the silence and simply waiting for the moment those lights went dark? The tapping started before she was fully awake. That's the part that still gets to her, the fact that her mind registered the sound before her eyes even opened. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the wooden frame of her bedroom window. Not frantic, not random, rhythmic, patient, like something that had been standing out there for a while, waiting for just the right moment to announce itself. It was 6 in the morning, and she'd only just been pulled from sleep by a phone call from the hospital. A shift change issue, something routine, the kind of call that leaves you half-conscious and irritable. She'd hung up and was lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, when it happened. Tap, tap, tap. She told herself it was a branch, wind, a bird, maybe, but even as she ran through the list, something in her gut was already rejecting every explanation. The sound was too measured, too intentional. There was a pause between each knock, as if whatever was making it understood the concept of waiting. She didn't move for a long moment. The room felt smaller than usual, the darkness thicker, pressing in from the corners. Her eyes drifted toward the window, though she couldn't see anything through the curtain, just the faint gray suggestion of pre-dawn light bleeding around the edges. Then she remembered the gate. Her property is enclosed by a metal fence, and the gate at the entrance has a hinge that screams when it opens. It's not a subtle sound. It's the kind of squeal that wakes you up from 2 rooms away, the kind of noise that makes neighbors glance out their windows. She'd been meaning to oil it for months, but honestly, she'd come to appreciate it as a kind of alarm system. Nobody got into that yard without her knowing. She hadn't heard it open. She lay there doing the math, and the math didn't work. To reach her bedroom window, a person would have had to come through that gate. The gate would have screamed. She would have heard it. She was already awake, already alert from the phone call. The yard between the gate and her window wasn't small. There was gravel. There were leaves. A person crossing it in the dark would have made noise. There had been nothing, just silence, and then the tapping. She got up eventually, heart hammering in a way she tried to dismiss as leftover adrenaline from being woken abruptly. She checked the window. She checked the yard. In the thin early light, she could see the fence, the gate, still latched, and the empty stretch of ground between them and her house. No footprints in the soft dirt near the flower bed beneath her window. No broken branches. No sign that anything had been there at all. She went to work and told herself she'd imagined it. But the thought followed her through her shift, surfacing at odd moments between patients, in the elevator, during the quiet stretches of the night when the ward settled into its uneasy hush. She kept replaying the sound in her head, the spacing of it, the deliberateness. By the time she got home the next evening, she'd made a decision. She set up a voice recorder in her bedroom, positioned near the window, and went to bed. She almost forgot about it by morning. She'd slept through the night without incident. And in the daylight, the whole thing felt slightly embarrassing, the kind of overreaction that seems reasonable at 3 a.m. and foolish by noon. She picked up the recorder mostly out of habit, plugged it into her laptop, and scrolled through the audio without much expectation. The timestamp read 11:41 p.m. She almost missed it. A long stretch of silence, the ambient hiss of a quiet room, and then a crash. Something heavy, something falling. The unmistakable sound of an impact followed by the clatter of smaller objects scattering. It lasted only a few seconds. Then silence again, deep and absolute, as if the night had swallowed whatever had made the sound. She sat very still, listening to it a second time. A third. Then she went outside. The yard was exactly as she'd left it. Nothing overturned, nothing broken. The patio furniture was in place, the potted plants undisturbed, the gravel undisturbed. She walked the entire perimeter, checking every corner, looking for anything that could account for what she'd heard. There was nothing. Not a fallen branch, not a knocked-over bin, not so much as a displaced stone. Whatever had made that sound had left no evidence that it had ever existed. She stood in the middle of her yard for a long time, the morning air cool against her skin, and felt the particular, creeping unease of a person who has run out of rational explanations. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was something quieter and more unsettling than fear. It was the feeling of a world that had stopped making sense in a very specific, very targeted way. She ordered the cameras that same afternoon. Night vision, motion activated, covering every angle of the perimeter. She mounted them herself over the following weekend, checking the feeds obsessively, making sure there were no blind spots. She hasn't heard the tapping again, but she checks the footage every morning now, before she does anything else. Before coffee, before her phone, before she's even fully awake. She scrolls through the night's recordings with the careful, methodical attention of someone who has learned that the absence of an explanation is not the same thing as the absence of a threat. She watches the empty yard, the still gate, the dark corners where the light doesn't quite reach. And every morning, so far, there is nothing there. She's not sure if that makes her feel better or worse. The night it happened, I was 15 years old, and I was alone in the house except for my mother. That detail matters, because what came to our door that evening wasn't looking for her. It was looking for me. I remember the exact moment the knock came. I was upstairs in my room, lying on my bed with the lights off, half watching something on my laptop, the blue glow of the screen the only light in the room. My mother was downstairs in the kitchen. I could hear the faint sounds of her moving around, the clink of a glass, the low murmur of the television in the background. Normal sounds, safe sounds, the kind of sounds that make you feel like the world is exactly what it's supposed to be. Then the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not urgent, not frantic, patient, like whoever was on the other side of that door had all the time in the world and knew, with absolute certainty, that someone would answer. I heard my mother's footsteps cross the kitchen floor. I heard the soft click of the front door opening. And then I heard her voice, that polite, cautious tone she used with strangers, followed by something else. 2 voices, deep, low, accented in a way I couldn't immediately place. Something European, something clipped and precise. I sat up in bed. I don't know what made me uneasy so quickly. Maybe it was the hour. It was past 9, and we weren't expecting anyone. Maybe it was the way the voices carried through the floor, flat and businesslike, with no warmth in them at all. Or maybe it was something more instinctive than that. Some animal part of my brain that registered danger before my conscious mind had caught up. I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down. Through the narrow gap of the open front door, I could see them. 2 men, tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that makes a door frame look small, broad through the shoulders. Built like people who had spent a long time being physically imposing on purpose. They were dressed identically in dark suits, black or very close to it, the kind of formal clothing that looks strange and out of place on a residential street at night. No ties, no badges, nothing that identified them as anything official. Just 2 enormous men in dark suits standing on my mother's front porch like they'd been placed there. Their faces were in shadow. The porch light caught the edges of them, the line of a jaw, the pale skin of a hand, but their expressions were unreadable. My mother was speaking to them in that careful, measured way she had. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught the shape of the conversation. They were asking for someone. And then I heard it clearly, cutting through the ambient noise of the house like a blade. My name, my full name, first, middle, last, spoken in that flat, accented voice with the kind of precision that told me they hadn't guessed it, hadn't approximated it. They knew it, every syllable, exactly right. I pressed myself back against the wall at the top of the stairs, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mother didn't miss a beat. I'll give her that. Whatever she felt in that moment, and I know now that she must have felt something close to terror, she kept her voice completely steady. She told them she didn't know who they were talking about. She told them there was no one here by that name. She told them they must have the wrong house. There was a pause, a long one. And then one of the men spoke again, and even from the top of the stairs, even through the floor and the walls and the distance between us, I could hear something in his voice that made my skin go cold. Not anger, not frustration, something worse than either of those things. Patience. He sounded patient, like he didn't believe her, and it didn't matter, because he wasn't in any hurry. My mother said goodnight and closed the door. I heard the lock turn, then the deadbolt. Then she stood in the hallway for a moment without moving, and the silence in the house was so complete that I could hear her breathing from where I stood. She came upstairs. She didn't call out to me. She just came up the stairs and found me standing in the dark hallway, and she looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, quietly, that I should stay away from the windows. I asked her who they were. She said she didn't know. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I listened. The house was quiet. The television downstairs had been turned off. My mother moved through the rooms below me without turning on any lights, and I understood, without being told, that she was checking the windows, making sure the curtains were drawn, making sure we couldn't be seen. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard it, the low, idle rumble of a car engine. Close, too close to be passing traffic, the kind of sound an engine makes when a car is parked and running, just sitting there, not going anywhere. I knew, without looking, that it was them. I knew they hadn't left. I lay down on my bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to think about what I had done, what I could possibly have done to bring 2 men like that to my door. I was 15. I went to school. I played video games. I had a small, ordinary life in a small, ordinary house, and I could not construct a single explanation for why 2 large men in black suits, with German accents, would know my full name and come looking for me after dark. That was the worst part. Not the fear, though the fear was real and it was bad. The worst part was the not knowing. The complete, bewildering absence of any context that might have made sense of what was happening. 30 minutes. That's how long they stayed. I know because I watched the clock on my phone, the numbers changing in the dark, each minute feeling longer than the last. 30 minutes of that engine idling outside. 30 minutes of knowing they were out there, sitting in their car, watching the house, watching the windows, waiting. For what? I still don't know. At some point, the engine sound faded. I heard the car pull away, the noise diminishing down the street until it was gone entirely. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, heavier somehow. Like the air in the room had changed. My mother came to check on me. She sat on the edge of my bed, and we talked in low voices, though there was no longer any reason to be quiet. She told me she had written down the license plate number. She told me she had thought about calling the police, but wasn't sure what she would say. 2 men knocked on the door and asked for my son by name. They stood outside for half an hour. They didn't threaten us. They didn't do anything. What would you even report? We never found out who they were. We never found out how they knew my name, my full name, all 3 parts of it, spoken with that horrible, careful precision. We never found out what they wanted, or why they came, or whether they ever came back when we weren't home to notice. I'm older now. I've spent years turning that night over in my mind, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the explanation I missed at 15. I've come up with theories. I've dismissed them. I've come up with more. None of them satisfy me. What I keep coming back to is this. They knew my name, not my mother's name, not a neighbor's name, mine, a 15-year-old boy's name, full and complete, spoken at the door of his house after dark by 2 men who had no reason to know it and no explanation for why they did. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they were looking for me specifically. And I have never, in all the years since, been able to stop wondering why.